It's Alaska Book Week. And before we begin tonight with our program, I'd like to thank the Alaska Center for the Book for inviting us to have this conversation. My name's Martha Amore, and I'm a local Anchorage writer. I'm also a professor of writing at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I'm thrilled tonight to be talking about rescue stories with Lucian Childs.
Hi, Lucian Childs. I'm a longtime Alaskan. I lived in Alaska for 25 years. I believe that's the longest I lived anywhere in my life. I currently, though, live in Toronto, Ontario, but I carry Alaska with me wherever I go. So I still think of myself as Alaskan, even though I'm not living there. Martha and I met many moons ago at the Kachemak Bay Writers Conference, and we were absolutely thrilled to death because we found that we both wrote fiction, and fiction writers are a little bit few and far between in Alaska. So we're very happy to find each other, and we have been working together ever since. We co-edited the Alaska, help me out,
LGBTQ.
There it is, LGBTQ anthology of short fiction and poetry, and which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Awards in 2017. So we've been thinking about writing and fiction and nonfiction for a long time, and we're going to talk specifically tonight about rescue stories.
Yeah, and as fate would have it, Lucian and I, even though we're both fiction writers, what we're discussing is nonfiction. And I have not written a whole lot of nonfiction. I've written a few essays, like I could count the number of essays on one hand that are nonfiction that I've published. So the vast majority of my writing is fiction. And so not only have Lucian and I each published nonfiction, we also published rescue stories, and we actually published them in the same place, which is the Anchorage Press. So anyway, we're going to be focusing tonight on a lot of different components that have to do with these creative nonfiction essays. We went about the stories in really different ways, and actually our rescue situations were very different. So first, Lucian, do you want to just say a little bit about your situation? I'll say a little bit about my situation, and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Sure. This is back in 1995. I'd only been in Alaska for 3 years at that point. And but I was a very experienced hiker and been hiking a lot for those 3 years. And we went on a late hike. It was the middle of October, and there was termination dust on the mountain. And I was a little trepidatious about that because one, the day was so short, and hiking on snow. And when we were coming back, we had to glissade. We could have walked down, but it was much funner, my friends thought, to slide down this. It was about a 45-degree angle hill, tundra, and they slid down successfully, but I went off to the right into the creek and tumbled over and basically tore my scalp off. And so the story that I wrote is there was about 40 to 50 people involved in my rescue, both from the Air National Guard and the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group. And so I attempted to tell the story of this rescue from multiple points of view. I called it The Anatomy of a Rescue, because I was just fascinated by how all these people came together and so efficiently, and how they saved my life.
Yeah, and my story is very different than yours. However, I felt my life was very much that close to being extinguished. What happened to me as I was driving from Anchorage to Fairbanks, I was on the road system. I was almost to Cantwell, and I was listening to music and driving and eating an apple. And I guess I took a big breath to belt out the song right as I chomped into the apple, and I choked on it. And I choked for a long time. And when I could finally breathe again, my breathing seemed restricted, and I felt like my throat was swelling. And so anyway, I was almost at Cantwell. I called emergency services because I thought my throat was about to close and I would be choking again and die this time, right? And so I was rescued by what turned out to be a volunteer ambulance crew. Everybody involved, there were 3 people involved, all volunteers, and they were just so amazing, all 3 of them, and rescued me really quickly. They got there within like 10 minutes. I don't understand. One of them was at his day job working for the state of Alaska, and somehow they got there really quickly. They ended up driving me all the way to Fairbanks. And so I got to know them a little bit on the way to Fairbanks, and more just by watching how they acted, their interactions. But then I ended up doing a charity walk with them a couple days later on my way back down. And actually, I even talked with Marge, the supervisor of the ambulance, who's an older woman, 78 years old. I also talked with her the day before because she helped me get back to my car in Cantwell. And I got to know them and hear some of their other stories. And I was really impressed by them. I was small potatoes. Like they said I was actually a pretty easy case to fix, but they do backcountry rescues as well, and people who were in much rougher shape than I was. So my first question for Lucian is, before you had this experience being rescued, had you ever considered writing rescue stories? And did you even think about rescue workers very much before your own experience?
Yeah, I think when I first got to Alaska, I was really fascinated by Mount Denali and by climbing Denali, and I read a lot of the early histories of the early climbs of Denali, and so when you read about that, of course, you also read about the many rescues that happen each year, and more as more people now are climbing the mountain. And I guess that was my only really exposure to thinking about mountain rescues in Alaska. But then, after I'd been in Alaska for a number of years, my fascination with climbing went away. And no, not much, really. It's something that is happening in Alaska probably almost every day, but it's out of sight, out of mind for most of us until something like this happens to you. And then you realize really what incredible people these are. Not only are they incredibly skilled and highly trained, but just the wherewithal to do this. I mean, the people in Alaska Mountain Rescue Group, they love being out in the wilderness, and this is a way that they can be out there and to pay back to the community. And so I didn't really, the short answer is no, not until they came up the hill and started bandaging me. And then that's all I could think about for quite a long time.
Yeah, I'm similar in that I mean, I never considered writing rescue stories. I'm not a rescuer, and it's just something that never occurred to me. And I'm a fiction writer for the most part. And so like you, I'd also read quite a bit about Alaska rescue situations with mountaineering and kayaking, stories like that, and bear attacks. And I like rescue literature quite a bit. I have several friends who are involved with rescues. I have a parajumper friend. I have a friend who she's a helicopter pilot and does medevacs. I've known several people involved with the mountain rescue group. And so I knew that, but I never really thought about it deeply, like what it is to rescue somebody, how much training it takes, how much of one's life it takes. I never really deeply considered that until I was rescued and talked to the people who rescued me, and really, I mean, I was just blown away by their attitude of giving and their attitude of service. Um, so, like you, also, once I got rescued, I could not stop thinking about not only my rescuers, but all the rescuers. You know, I guess specifically in Alaska because I'm here. Um, I mean, maybe it's like almost a form of PTSD, but for me, it was a positive form because I kept thinking back on all the caring that, you know, in the giving. And so it seems like I'm thinking about it a little less now, but I'm actually inspired to the point where the next book project I would like to write is a nonfiction, creative nonfiction book project that somehow pays tribute to the rescuers. So I'm not quite sure how it's going to come together. Maybe I'll profile several different people. Maybe I'll just focus on Marge because she was this, as I said, the supervisor of the ambulance who rescued me and has been doing this for decades on a voluntary basis. And she just has so many great stories. I could see writing just a whole book if she would let me. I think she's working on her own book though. So yeah, it's funny how you don't think about something until you do, because you need to.
Well, since this is a forum about books and writers, why don't we cut to a writerly question, and probably like the hardest one we'll tackle tonight. Mark Twain famously said, "Never let the facts get in the way of a good story." Pam Houston said something similar, according to Montana Public Radio. She promises 82% truth in fiction, and she doesn't believe there's much difference between fiction and nonfiction. Since we're both fiction writers, how did you come to writing a nonfiction piece? Did you bend any of the facts to make it be a better story, either in the timeline or organization? And what do you find are the similarities or between writing fiction, as we've struggled for so many years to do, and writing nonfiction?
Well, I tried to stick to the truth of the situation. However, because there's a lot of dialogue in my piece, some of the dialogue I put before it actually occurred, and structurally in the story. So, for example, some of the things I learned about my crew I put in the story before I got to the point in the story where I was in the hospital texting my daughters, because their reactions were really good, and I wanted the reader to know more about my rescuers before they got to my daughter's reactions to the rescuers. And so I didn't make up any of the dialogue. I did condense some of it, you know, as one does. You don't write every single word. You can't, you know, unless you're recording. And I know journalists will record usually if they're doing an interview, but I was not recording, so I was just remembering the spirit of the conversations. So I did go ahead and place them structurally at different points in the story, just to build a good story. I did not ask if, or I didn't just go ahead and publish. I decided that I wanted the two main crew who I talked to the most and wrote about the most. I actually sent it to them in part to fact check, to make sure I remembered, you know, the spirit of the conversations correctly. And I didn't want to publish anything that they were uncomfortable with, because I was publishing in Alaska and not in an obscure journal, actually in a Anchorage press, which is really easy to share online. And so I wanted them to be okay with it, and they both were. And, you know, so I guess that was the little bit of fact checking that I did.
But in terms of the larger question of the, the tools we bring as fiction writers to writing nonfiction. I mean, what do you think are the similarities between writing fiction, or the differences? It's kind of a wonky question, but I'm sure
Yeah.
there are writers out there and readers that might be interested.
I'm not a journalist, and I don't consider myself in any way, shape, or form a journalist. I wouldn't want to be a journalist. So I take the creative part of the creative nonfiction to heart. So when I sit down to write, I'm really in the mindset of fiction, just that feeling you get where I'm using all these different tools, um, style tools, with the language itself, maybe alliteration, maybe a metaphor. I'm bringing all that to bear on the writing. I think the main difference for me is that when I'm writing nonfiction, there really is something that happened that I'm trying to capture. Whereas when I'm writing fiction, it's in my mind. Like I don't necessarily write true to the facts of my life. So what I often do in my fiction is I'll start out often with a character who is kind of like me to some degree, but oftentimes she's making like worse choices. For example, I think that's the fun in fiction writing for me, is I could live these different lives and I could kind of go down paths that I haven't in my own life. So I find that fiction writing is far more open-ended in that sense. Whereas with nonfiction, I really am trying to get to the heart of some truth, something that happened that maybe I haven't completely figured out. And in the case of my rescue story, it was, as much as it was about my rescuers, it was also about my feelings for my rescuers. And I feel like a journalist would be more just capturing the details. I did have one journalist friend suggest that I write a piece just about them and completely cut myself out of it. And maybe I could publish, he's a stringer for the Wall Street Journal. And he said if I shortened it, just took myself completely out of it. And I was like, I don't want to, I'm a creative nonfiction writer. I don't want to take myself completely 100% out of the story. I don't know why. Maybe secretly I'm kind of a memoir writer. I like to make that filter apparent. Like this is what I'm writing about, but you're getting it through me and making that apparent.
We're going to touch on the structure a little bit later, but just to me, with this issue of what's the difference between fiction and nonfiction, I have to admit that I haven't read a lot of creative nonfiction. I mean, I love to read like science writing and stuff. I've just read this incredible book, Ahab's Rolling Sea. It's about the natural history of Moby Dick. And Bill Strever's books, Cold and Wind, and so I'm not like the maybe the best person to answer this question, but I have listened to a lot of nonfiction at workshops and stuff, and what they have done primarily is they start with a personal anecdote and then they explode to a larger issue. Say, like for us, we would have started with this accident that happened, and then we would explode to an essay about mortality, say. And then we would come back to the episode. But I'm a fiction writer, and in fiction writers, and this, I'm sure there are many creative nonfiction writers who do this too. So I don't want to brand everybody with the same brush, but fiction writers really can't go to the meaning right away. We have to dramatize. We have to draw the reader in and try to make it so that the reader feels like they're experiencing it themselves, and then they can pull whatever meaning out of it that they find. Of course, we can kind of lead them along into certain suggestions about what a piece might mean. But that for me is what I primarily wanted to do. And many people since I've reposted this have said that you really feel like you're there. And that's exactly what I want to do with the piece. So how is there a difference between writing fiction and nonfiction? Fiction, you have facts, but we have facts too, right? We have characters that we've created, and you can't just make them do whatever you want them to do. They have lives that we've crafted, and they have backstories. The things that they do have to be authentic and organic. So the stories may be made up, but as one of my characters in one of my stories says, they may be made up, but they're still true. And so we can't just be willy-nilly making people do stuff. We have a truth that we have to conform to as well. It's not strictly factual all the time, but it goes to the emotional truth of the character. So I think there's a lot of crossover between the two, and it was great for me to write this piece. I really approached it as this piece is really puts the creative in creative nonfiction, because there is reporting in it, and all of it has, I interviewed all the people, but it's really like, you're there. And then we can talk about structure in a minute, but to me, I don't know that they are different, but certainly we have different approaches to working at with the material.
And one more word, and then I'll ask a question about structure. But actually, first character we'll get to, because I'm really interested in the characters. When you said our truths, I think in any type of creative writing, it's the felt truth that's most important. So one example, when I was writing my story, I could have begun with actually my life was never in danger. Once I could slightly breathe again, my life was never in danger. And that's how Marge and my crew looked at it. Like, once we found out that we didn't know till we got to the hospital and I got scoped, but it wasn't going to come out again, right? And choke me again. And my throat was not going to swell any more than it had. We didn't know that, though. In fact, I didn't really feel completely confident I was okay until the middle of the night, that night when my throat felt normal again, because it had been swollen and the apple was still in there, but eventually it went down. Even after the doctor assured me it's not going to come back out and choke you, it's where it is, and so my perspective was different, even than Marge's perspective, because I really thought I was about to choke and die, and that's how I felt. And so when I wrote the story, I wanted the reader to think that for much of the story, because that's how it felt to me. And so if I began with this, actually it was all fine, that would take a lot of the tension out of it, right? That wouldn't really be the felt truth of the experience. Now, if Marge wrote her story, it might be different. She was worried until a certain point, and then after the scope, she was, you know what I mean? So
mine was very different. I mean, it's like propulsive and dramatic all the way through, because you're talking about a ground rescue attempt, and then an air lifting me out on this jungle penetrator thing, and them radioing the hospital to make sure that there was a brain surgeon on call, because they thought maybe I had brain damage because I was convulsing. So you really don't know my piece, if I'm going to come out of it a vegetable or not. And luckily, none of that happened, but it's very propulsive. So let's talk about character.
Yeah, so I would like to hear. There's a lot of characters in your piece. Some we learn about more than others, right? So tell me about your experience capturing these characters in your story. So, did you use your writer's tools? Do you feel that you distorted any of your characters? You know, in a piece where you only have so many words and you have a lot of characters, you have to make some big decisions on what to include about that person and what to not include, right? So tell me about your experience with writing these characters.
Well, I think one of the things that helped me is that, you know, I mean, the owner of and publisher of the press at that time was Nick Coltman, and he was just aghast that I was coming in with this like massive tome, you know, and you know, I had to cut it way back, and so I always think limitations are actually very helpful. The constraints of any sort are really helpful when you're writing, and that was one of them. The other constraint was that because I didn't have a huge number, a big word count, I just really had to concentrate on the action. So it's just propulsive, bang, bang, bangs. This happens, you know, and you're just carried along. So you don't, you know, really deeply delve into the characters. It's more what they did. The only exception being of the man who was up on the mountain with me. My two friends ran down, because this was in 1995, so this is before everybody had cell phones, so they had to run down to the highway to try to find somebody who had a cell phone, and they left my friend Matthew up there. And Matthew's a very unusual person. He had been very religious earlier in his life, and it was no longer, but he kind of transformed that religious impulse into belief in spirituality and a belief in angels and sort of spirits and stuff like that. So there's a couple of moments, one in particular, where the cloud bank is coming up the Turnagain Arm and moving up the Falls Creek Canyon, and of course, if that happens, the helicopter can't come, and so he invokes the spirits to help them, and then sure enough, the clouds recede, and so he has this moment of sort of like revelation there, and so with his character, there was a high degree of, as we say now, interiority. So the language gets more poetic in those sections, whereas in the other sections it's more focused on the action, and so the other characters are, I think, you know, they're mostly about what they do and not who they are, as people.
Mm-hmm. Although what they do certainly says something about who they are, right?
Yes, in a big way, right?
Yeah. I felt I also had a word count restraint. You know, I think my piece started at 20 pages, 20 double space pages, and I felt like I had a lot I was leaving out, and then the editor Matt Hickman wanted me to cut it down to 1,500 words, which is really pretty short. I got away with 2,000, you know, so I went over a little bit, and he let me do it. I found it to be interesting cutting down like that. I did have to cut out stuff that I really like, and so then I'm like, the book, right? If I could get to write that one day. But I know that I did distort Marge's character somewhat, and that is because in the piece, like she's such an amazing person, and she's really funny, and she has a very terse edge to her that I saw and really appreciated, but she also had like a softer side, and because my impression that terseness just like affected me so much, I really wanted that to go in. Like I really didn't want to cut that out. So I think if I had more of a word count, I would show some more of the softness, I suppose. But then again, when we say the word character when we're writing creative nonfiction, because it's our impression and it's our words that represent the real person. So whatever we're writing isn't the real person. You know, it might not be their own perspective of themselves. even art, it's a representation of the real person, which is why I always think of characters, not the actual people themselves.
Well, this kind of brings up an issue about Marge, and maybe you've kind of already answered it, but she's sort of a tough as nails, no nonsense woman, and you see that in Alaska, and you see that in Alaskan fiction a lot, and sort of a larger than life character. So I'm just wondering how you approach humanizing her so that she kind of didn't come across as a stock character.
Right. Well, I think in part it's the actions, and exactly like your story, the actions that people take, really do, it is them. So when somebody is giving so much of their own life, somebody's so charitable, it's almost like words are cheap beyond, like what the people might say or whatever. It's like, I see what they do, and that is everything, they're golden. And there's a lot of people in Alaska, I feel that way about. I see what they do, and they might not be, well, whatever, they might not talk a good game like a politician would talk, but I see what they do. And so gosh, the stock characters, I think when you think of the idea of stereotype, there's a great TED talk by Adichie, the writer from, gosh, I think she's from Nigeria. Adichie is her last name. And she talks about stereotypes, and she says, stereotypes, the problem with stereotypes isn't that they're not true. And, it's that stereotypes aren't complete. And so, I've really been thinking about that a lot since I saw the TED talk. So there is something to like tough Alaska women. I've met so many of them, like especially in, away from the big city, but even a lot of them in the big city I've met, I'm like, oh my gosh, you did what? And there is that Alaska toughness, but it's not complete. So I think the stock character problem is when you only write that, and you don't write unique other things about the person. So just by going deeper and capturing the true details of somebody's life, well, in nonfiction, I think you don't have to worry about the stock character. Did you worry about that with some of your characters, especially the ones who,
I don't think so, but I love that. I think it's George Lucas. He said, because he does Star Wars and science fiction and space stuff, and he said the problem, and he does a lot with not stereotypes, but heroic figures and the hero's path and all that stuff. And he says the problem isn't that there are stereotypes in creating art. The problem is to get the stereotypes right, and
yeah.
so even as I love a lot of science fiction and stuff that's entirely stereotypical, but they just when they really dig down there into these characters that you think you've seen before, and you realize that you don't know them in the way that these people are being presented.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. What do you want to talk about next?
So I have a question for you that I think is more that I don't even know that I would want to answer this, because this is really something that's specific to your story. I want to know how you decided on the structure of your story, because it is a really, I've never read a short essay like this before. I've read book length works that do this, but
I think I've lost you.
Even his personal narrative part, where he's kind of writing from his own perspective, it's from the second person, the you perspective. So putting the reader in as the person getting rescued. So there's a lot going on with point of view. And how did you decide to take that risk? Because that is a risk. It's non-traditional.
It is very non-traditional, especially for magazine or newspaper writing. One, at that time, I really, it was just before I was a writer, and but I've been an English major and I've read a lot in my life, and I'd written some before, and so the nice thing about that is I didn't know about any rules. I didn't know about the rule that you're not supposed to head hop. You go to workshop and if you change POV, people will jump all over you. They'll go POV shift, and you learn pretty quickly in workshop not to do that. But I didn't know anything about that then, and I think I was really influenced by visual arts, by TV writing, especially at that time, Hill Street Blues and things like that. Stephen Bochko, I think was this guy's name. He kind of started this thing where you would have your A story, your B story, your C story, your D story, and you intercut between them. And you would kind of go back and forth in time, and then it would all kind of like fall in place. And by 1995, when I wrote this, that was a very common technique in TV and in films too. And when you read this piece again, it is very cinematic. And so I think I was coming from that point of view, and that really fit because there were so many moving parts to this. If I wanted to write a kind of you were there sort of a piece, and I had to incorporate all these different, because there was things happening like Coulis and Air Force Base, and down at the parking lot, and up at the accident site, and there was a helicopter, and there was a C-130 way up in there. There was a lot of stuff going on. How could I do that in a way that felt like you were there? And so in my sublime ignorance about writing, I just did this thing where the POV is shifting all the time. And I tried to make it so that the shifts came at dramatic moments, and to keep because in TV writing, each one of those segments ends with what they call a button, which is a kind of a cliffhanger. So you get to just one crucial point, and then it breaks away to the B story, right? And then
a commercial.
Yeah. Right, commercial verse, but it keeps it very propulsive, and so that's kind of where it was coming from. The person that had the accident, I didn't want that person to be me. This is way before autofiction was a thing. Now I would create a character called Lucian Childs, and he would be this character. But I didn't know anything about autofiction, but I had read J. McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City, which was a very big book back in the day, and that was all second person. And so I thought, I'll do it from the second person, so it won't be about me. And of course, later when I started going to workshops, and I learned that you stories were kind of a thing. But so that's kind of where it came from.
Yeah, it was it worked really well. It was a really interesting story because of that. I think sometimes when you take a risk and do something non-traditional, sometimes it just doesn't work. But I think it did in this case. And when it does work, I think you should get a lot of extra credit because you took a risk and it worked. I know that story will stay in my mind, not just because it was you, my friend, that it happened to, but for the structure alone. Like that'll always stay in my head.
I did deeply
open the possibility.
I did deeply report it. I interviewed all those guys really exhaustively, and so even though it has the feeling of a fiction piece, really, all that stuff there is also a lot of factual stuff in there too, and so I think it helps that it's really grounded in action, and all those actions are pretty dramatic. So the shifts are for the most part kind of abrupt and very clear when the shifts happen. So
Right.
I
Definitely.
was,
It was never confusing. It was never confusing as to, wait, where are we? It was
right.
clear.
I was a little scared to go back to it, but when your piece came out, I thought, well, let me read this, and I went, wow, this is actually not too bad, right?
Yeah. And now here's a question. So you said that by putting the second person perspective, the you perspective, in a sense, you were kind of removing Lucian's identity from there. And I see that, and I actually might even see the psychology of that. We can get there in a minute. I was thinking in my story, I kept me, Martha, who I am, but I actually gave very little about myself. And when I was writing, I wondered, oh, should I be giving more about who I am, like what I do for a living? But really all you know about me is I'm going from Anchorage to Fairbanks.
Right.
I've been in Alaska a while, and I have 3 daughters, and I specifically didn't want to put more of myself in the story because I really wanted myself in as the victim and the filter where we could see the rescue crew. I wanted it to be about them,
Right.
and I wanted it to be about them in a worshipful way. I don't know how else to say it, but I wanted my feelings about them to be there, but I didn't want it to be about my life.
Right.
So
I felt exactly the same. I mean, I just felt this huge feeling of gratitude, and I wanted to kind of celebrate these guys. And I was afraid when I went before I went back to look at it, it was just going to be you, meaning me. And I was heartened to find that the person who had the accident is not in it. I mean, I don't know. They're in it way more than I am, and I was very heartened by that because I want this to be that piece to honor them, as all of them, but especially the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group, who is an all volunteer organization.
Mm-hmm. And I think there really is a difference in rescue stories if you're getting the story from the rescuer versus getting the story from the rescued. I remember talking to Lee, who was the EMT, and he said, and he was just a few years older than me. He's the youngster in the crew. And during our walk, I was like, oh, and I was gushing about them. And he's like, it's just like something we do. It wasn't personal. That's what he said. Because I was like, I can't believe you took off work in the middle of the day to come. And he's like, it wasn't personal. And I said, to me, it was very personal. It was very personal. And so the rescue story really can shift depending on whose perspective we're getting it from.
I mean, I do talk a little bit about it because they were really heartened by my rescue, because most of what the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group does is not rescue. They mostly do body retrievals, and they were so psyched that they actually, brought somebody off the mountain alive. And it was cute because they gave you a nickname, Eve, because of the apple, but they gave me a nickname too, because I was talking to them the whole time. I was trying to normalize the situation, and they called me Lucid Lucian.
I'm gonna have to remember that.
I couldn't put it in the story because I didn't use my name in the story, But for
really
years,
cool.
I would run into those guys at events in Anchorage, and they would say, "Oh, it's Lucid Lucian."
That's amazing. And they were probably always cheered to see you. Like, he's still there. He's still doing well.
Yeah.
No lingering effects.
Right.
Oh, that's amazing. Let's see. I have a question for you. You write beautifully about the Alaska landscape in your story. And how important was it to you to capture the land in the artful way? I mean, did it just kind of come out as you're writing, or um, did you intentionally engage with it? Like, do you think your story would be just as good if you didn't have landscape writing?
No. I mean, I think it's the goal I do with any story, right? Is you know, you really, it's all about specificity, right? You know, stories don't happen like in some amorphous place. They happen in a specific place at a specific time. And our task as writers is to make that be very vivid for the reader, so that you know the reader is really a participant in the story, and they can only participate in the story if you know we're kind of creating a movie in their mind, you know, so to make the setting very very clear and the actions very clear. So this took place in a quite an extraordinary place in the Alaskan landscape that I love so much. And so um, you know, you hear this a lot, but you know, it is true. It's like the landscape is another character, and it's a character that is sometimes working against the characters of the people in the story. You know, you've got the impending bad weather that's coming in, you know, and then it goes away, and then it comes back, you know, and you've got the walls of Falls Creek, you know, and the helicopter having to negotiate it, and so I mean, I try to do that in every story, is to make it very specific. But the Alaska landscape, of course, people love to write about it because that extraordinary beauty, I think, also requires extraordinarily beautiful and precise use of words, and so it kind of inspires that, I think, really. Don't you think? I mean, you also write about the Alaskan landscape as well.
Yeah, and I had a friend in my MFA program who gave some good advice one time. Um, and he was talking about if you have to cut the word count to a story, rather than trying to like keep all of the plot or even all of the characters and strip out other things, he was like, maybe it's better to like go more like just go deeper into a moment,
Mhm,
right? So that
mhm.
um and I struggled. I worried I'd have to cut out the, you know, I don't write a ton about the landscape, but the part I left in, I really wanted to leave in, and I thought of my friend's advice, like rather than the breadth of an experience, go for the depth of it. And that includes all those sensory details. And the landscape, we don't just see the landscape, we feel it, we smell
Mhm.
it. You can even taste it, like it's salt air, you can taste on your lips, you know, and to try to keep all those elements, because that's what the reader wants. You know, the reader wants to be there. Gosh, well, we're almost out of time. I was going to ask about let's see, maybe one or two more questions about the publishing, because I know a lot of people watching this are writers themselves and thinking, publishing, why did you choose the Anchorage Press as your publisher instead of, I mean, there's a lot of other places out there you could have published it.
Well, this is a very, you know, interesting time for me. I had just been in Alaska for 3 years, and I wasn't a writer. I was a graphic designer, and I was working as the graphic artist at the Anchorage Press. And it was me and this guy. I was doing the layout and printing it up, and there's a guy named Patrick who was waxing it up. We just actually have to wax up the little pieces, you know, back then. And editor was Chris Ritter. So this thing happened to me, and we kind of all did everything. You know, I would review movies and plays, and it was very kind of a seat of the pants kind of a thing back then, very kind of gonzo. It was a lot of fun, you know, staying up late at night listening to rock music and alternative rock. And so when this happened to me, you know, I just asked Chris and Nick if I could write a little piece about it, which then became like a 9,000 word thing. So mine was a little bit different in that, I wasn't writing back then. I wasn't submitting pieces to magazines. I mean, now if I was going to write a piece like this, I might, and so my relationship with the publisher was, he was my employer and friend. We used to hang out and go to humpies, and we went fishing one week, and so, and the word count was an issue, but that they just kind of sucked it up, and I think the whole issue practically was my story.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah, I thought originally, well, maybe I thought either the press or the Daily News. I thought the Daily News might be a harder sell because of the word count. And I was like, maybe if it was 500 or 800 words, they might take it, but I didn't want to cut it down that short. And I didn't think about this till later, but the great thing about the Anchorage Press, even though it's more of an Anchorage based paper. Like I was thinking the Daily News might, because I wanted it to go up north, I wanted it to be an Alaska thing, by the way. I didn't want to publish it outside of Alaska because I feel like it's a very Alaska story, and I wanted people to just know about this here. But what I hadn't thought about with the Anchorage Press is they don't have a paywall for their stories, so you can share them freely on social media. And that was actually the big life of my story, was not in the print version. It was actually the online shareable story, and it got shared a lot on social media. And of everything I've ever written, I have heard the most from people, including people I don't know, from this story. This short creative nonfiction story really seemed to touch a nerve in Alaska, or heartstrings or whatever. People read it, and I think when you publish literary stories, like, you might get them people don't really read it. I don't know how else to put it, but your audience,
even if they do, you don't know about it.
You don't know.
Yeah.
You
Well,
don't
it's
know.
interesting with mine because it was published in print, and I can't really remember, because I just had a brain injury, what the reaction was. But after I read your piece, I did edit it a little bit because I'm a much better writer now. So, but I didn't have to edit a lot, and I reposted it and put it on Facebook and stuff, and I got a lot of comments about it there. So it was heartening because it actually got this second life on social media because I don't think there was Facebook when I published it. So that was really great, and people are still reading it and telling me how much they like it. So
I think people are very interested in rescue stories because, the true story, I think that's a draw. And then the rescue story, there's going to be some good suspense, some thrills. But if the rescue was successful, there's also going to be kind of a feel good element.
yeah.
And I feel like in our world, we don't get enough of that feel good stuff. We want to shoot the holes in all the heroes. We want to drag down, right? Everyone's so cynical,
Right.
and everything's going terribly. But if you could get some feel good rescue story, like this person is a hero, right? And an unsung hero. A lot of these volunteers in Alaska are unsung heroes.
Yes, they are.
People are hungry for that kind of story.
And we're all like, especially, whatever time we're in, but especially now with how isolated we've all been the last year and a half, we all really need something to make us feel good. And since time immemorial, people have been telling stories about people overcoming adversity and succeeding and surviving. And so it really, does speak, I think, to something fundamental in people. maybe you need to wind up
Yeah.
here. I was just thinking maybe you could tell me a little bit about what you're working on now and where people can find you online. And
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, my coming project is going to be some kind of book length nonfiction, creative nonfiction piece that has to do with Alaska's volunteer rescuers, probably Alaska's women volunteer rescuers. And I'm just trying to get the details worked out of that. But I do have a website and a blog. That's marthaamore.com. So my name is here at the bottom of the screen here. It's spelled like that, but it's all lowercase, just marthaamore.com. And, I write a weekly post about whatever's on my mind. And I always update if I'm doing an event, if I'm working on something new, I let people know through that site.
great. Well, I'm over the moon because I submitted my short story collection. It was two groups of link stories, one set in Alaska, another set in San Francisco, and it got picked up by one of the most prestigious presses here in Canada, Biblioasis. They in 2019, they published Duck's Newburyport, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker. So I don't expect to be winning the Man Booker. I'll just put that out there right now. But
Never know.
published by somebody who has artists at that level it's way beyond what I thought would happen. But I've been very lucky in that regard. So it's called Dreaming Home, and that should come up next year, and you can find out about that at my website, which is lucianchilds.com. And I'm also tweeting up the storm at Lucian Childs on Twitter. And so hopefully the plan is that we would publish the Alaska stories as a separate standalone novella probably in 2023. So that's my goal. I guess we should also talk talking websites. Alaska Book Week is probably underway when you're viewing this video. So you can find the schedule there at alaskabookweek.org. And I have to just say, it is always a pleasure to be talking about writing and anything else with Martha. We've been doing this for a very long time now, and it always is fun.
Thank you, Lucian. It's been a blast, and I hope we could be back in front of a real audience. Hey, maybe when your book comes out, come up for a book tour, and I'll introduce you.
I plan to have you interview me at Barrett's what it's called, the writer.
Oh yeah, the writer's block.
The writer's block. Sorry, I blocked for a moment. Okay, nice. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Take care.